our Colorado Wild Horse Issue panel. And our panelist with us today is Patrick Craig with what we just watched with the Wild Horse Refuge. We have Sarah, I'm drawing a blank on the last name. Sarah Matlock with University of Colorado. College State University. Oh my God, why don't I just... That's what I mean. Colorado State. Okay. Hi, we're live here at the Rocky Mountain Horse Expo. I'm Lisa Dearson. I just keep buffooing. But anyway, I'm going to introduce our panel who is talking about the Colorado Wild Horse issues. We have Patrick Craig from the Wild Horse Refuge. We have Sarah Matlock with Colorado State University. And we have Lisa Mallory, who's here all the way from Aiken, South Carolina, where she runs her Mustang rescue. So we're going to let them talk to you a little bit about Mustangs in Colorado, off-range topics, and we're going to let them do a little chatting. And Lisa is also going to be hosting our event in Aiken, South Carolina in September. So here you guys go.
Thank you very much. So just to start off, when I was watching the video there, I was wondering how many HMAs there are, let's say, east of the Mississippi. I don't know. Get real close.
I don't think there are any HMAs east of the Mississippi. Are there, Lisa?
I don't think so.
I didn't think there were either,
No,
but I thought, well, maybe
there's
that's
not.
silly to assume that.
It's difficult for some of the East Coast people to adopt a Mustang. It's certainly not impossible because I have a lot at my house, but
Right.
it's more difficult.
Well, obviously the space is shrinking even out here where we still have millions of acres of BLM land. What's allocated to the horses is obviously a very small portion of that. So I'm sure back east it's a little bit harder to find, vast spaces that they can stay in.
Absolutely it is.
Yeah, so, when we first got involved, we did obviously look and try to get a better idea of all the HMAs and things, but our focus was obviously Colorado was our biggest focus because there's 4 herds here in Colorado, official herds, and then you find out that there's other herds that are not official HMAs that are either adjacent to or in their own little areas, and so there's really quite a lot more Mustangs that need help that aren't even really on the official map, you know what I mean? And so that just makes me even wonder about all the other states and how many official versus unofficial there really are.
I would definitely say there are unofficial feral populations of horses on the East Coast. Yeah, and towards the east.
Yeah, because you even hear about, so many of them that are on small islands along the East Coast and places like that. So, again, official HMAs, you're probably right. There's Mississippi, but there's probably quite a few horses, like you said. Yeah, so I wonder, I would assume that there's groups for pretty much every band of horses that has concerns or whatever, and there's citizen groups that are trying to help them, and that's great. Yeah. And so Colorado State University, we work with Colorado State University for the exotics that we have as well, and now that we started the horse refuge this year, the one in Northwest Colorado, we're looking to be able to interact with quite a bit. Hopefully not a lot, just because of needing help, medical help, but just in a way of managing the horses and some of the studies that go on and things like that.
Yeah, one thing we're actually working on right now, a grant to the BLM, some of their off-range grants. They have a lot of really good grants that are out there. And so the one we're looking at is an education grant, and it's really we would like to sort of manualize the gentling process to make it more accessible for folks, and really looking at evidence-based practices of training. When we talk about how horses learn and when we remove fear from that interaction, how much safer it is not only for the Mustang but also for the handlers, and accessible, how much more accessible it is for folks to be able to adopt a Mustang and train. When we really look at these non-aversive, fear-free training approaches, it makes it more open for more people
So would yours be based, obviously there's groups that do, we talk about tip training and things like that, but are your study or whatever the program is going to be for official like training sites, or would it be about for the individual person who adopts and then wants to do it? They have their own, let's say, property and they have their own barn, and is that what it's based on, is more of that?
Great question. Actually, it's both. So we're looking at how can we create more opportunities for Mustangs to be gentled in a university or an academic setting for students that are a part of an ag program or an equine sciences program, but also then creating online coursework and online videos for anybody that's adopting a Mustang to have access. We did a pilot study about 2 years ago. It was actually funded by Temple Grandin, so it was really neat. And looking at fear-free methods of gentling, where we actually clicker trained 15 Mustangs that came in off-range, and it was an amazing study, and we learned a lot. We learned where clicker training can work and some of the limitations with Mustangs, and where even just traditional pressure release training, when it's non-aversive, can be really effective. So we're hoping to kind of create a manual that's really user-friendly for anybody to understand. And, yeah.
That's great. I mean, from what our perspective is, you see so many individuals who really aspire to want to help the Mustangs, and they really want to adopt one, and they really are heartbroken when they try to do it and it doesn't work out. So creating a system that might help them would be tremendous, because that's a significant amount of horses that end up. Thankfully, a lot of them don't just end up having to end up at an auction house and going to wherever, but they might stay at the property but just never be able to be interacted with. But at least the people own up to keeping them for the rest of their life and things like that. But obviously the experience would be so much better if they could just work with a horse in any way.
I love what Sarah said about the evidence-based training that
I'm just running to a mic now, and this is
with the
coming off my
BLM,
camera.
correct? You're
So, I mean,
the proposal.
if just an XLR,
So,
or what else would I do?
I could do
So it's so interesting to me because I am a clicker trainer, and I'm very much in line with Sarah's methods. And I have also dreamed about someone coming up with a manual. And the reason for that is I often, on social media, I'm often seeing people who have to rehome after adopting. And I really think a manual based in science and available to those adopters would help tremendously, absolutely help tremendously. And that's such a blessing to be able to get more horses adopted and yet more horses to stay in those adopted homes.
Yeah, this is a universal problem for our equine industry in general. We have about 200,000 horses that end up in rescues every year, and that doesn't count Mustangs. And when we look at those, when we look at that data, about 35% of those cases are behavior-related cases. We've really kind of followed along more historical ideas of training and not really looked at what does the science say when we look at the stress of the animal. I think horses or Mustangs specifically are the perfect population because they won't let you get away with some of the kind of more traditional training practices that we'll use with domestic horses. Their flight response is so strong, their fear response is so strong, and so I think they're the great. This is a great way to say this is great methods for Mustangs, but any horse. It's good for any horse. Yeah.
So you said you had a study that led to this, that now you're doing a grant with the BLM to further that into this kind of like a training program that is universal or whatever. But in the previous work that you did you find that there was a tripping point where 80% or 90% did really good up to this one level, and then this is where a huge amount of them would fall off if they weren't treated exactly the right way, or didn't have this and this and this happen in a sequence that worked really well? And was that your experience? Because to me it seems like that is it. Most people get just so far and then it's just a plateau, and so I didn't know if that was much further or less with the program that you started with, clicker training and all that, whether that helped tremendously get it to a higher point or what?
Great question. We learned so much from this study. Ultimately, what we did was started all 15 of them with clicker training. And so the real rule that we had in the study was we weren't going to use any traditional pressure release. So, provide pressure release when they do a behavior. And so because of the way we were training, all 15 of the horses had the option to participate or not. They had free choice hay, they had free choice to alfalfa, which is what we used as our reinforcer. And so it was really up to them if they wanted to engage with us. We had 5 of them that were absolute all-stars. We had them haltered within a day or two. They would line up at the round, we worked them in these little pens. They would line up at the pen waiting for their turns. And then they'd get back in line. We have pictures of them just being so motivated to play. And they were gentled very quickly. And then we had 5 of them that took a little bit longer to engage. It took a little bit longer for those first touches. They didn't take food right away from our hands. As the story goes, they were still gentled within the same amount of time frame as a traditional training practice. It just took them a little bit longer. And then we had 5 that failed. We reached a point. They would let us touch on their faces. They would let us touch their tags. We were able to remove tags on 3 of them, but there were 2 that they would not ever let us go beyond that. And what I learned personally from that study is they were more reinforced by being able to leave us. Every time they could leave without any consequence, they got that felt really good to them. And so if they got a little scared and they left, that was more reinforcing and enticing than coming back. So we do have a new method now that for horses in that kind of personality population that can really help with that. We can chat about later, but yeah.
Well, yeah, that made me think about when we brought a lot of the horses up to the refuge, and I was always amazed that there's the ones that would just jump off a cliff to avoid that touch or anything, kill themselves in a heartbeat, where the other ones, there's some that just walk right up to you and go, hey, what's going on? And you're like, you're a wild Mustang, you should be at least a little afraid. And those were the exception. There was only a handful of those, but it was just amazing to see those ones have that propensity, just whether they were born that way or their experiences over time. Obviously, some of the horses we took in had been in holding at Canyon City for upwards of almost 2 years, so that may have had a huge part of it as well. But still, character-wise, we deal with lions and tigers and all sorts of animals. We see that in those as well. Some that are just like, yeah, I'm not worried at all. And other ones that are just so fear-based that they're willing to cut their head off to save themselves. You know what I mean? And so the one question I thought about when you were talking was, did it help at all if they were in a group setting, even if some were just watching the others being worked with, or were they always individuals and there was no observation?
Yeah, so we really believe in trying to meet, if you're familiar with the 5 domains of animal welfare, right? So it was really important to us that they had friends, forage, and freedom. And so they all were in pens together, and in the initial training we did the training in the pens with all of them. Once they got really good at clicker training and they understood the game, it's so much easier to separate in a pen, but they're still they can still nose to nose over the pen, so it wasn't truly isolated, like separation anxiety. We didn't see any of that. And so it's interesting in this study, I didn't see any training where they would learn from another horse learn in this study, but I have seen it at home with my own Mustang. So I do training. I have 3 Mustangs at home, and I have my Mustang. 10 years old. He was started with clicker training, and I can teach him something on cue, and 3-year-old girls will watch and then do it on cue. It's quite amazing, and I needed to share that.
I have to say that it's been a huge eye-opening experience for me. When we got our first Mustang and started our rescue, we always took a domestic horse. I have an old thoroughbred. We always would put him next to those Mustangs because he's fearless, he's calm, he's gentle, and I don't know, if there's any science behind it, but my husband and I, we really believe in that learning through observation. So we try to put a nice, calm, gentle horse that we can work with, we can brush, we can saddle him right next to those Mustangs, and I swear they learn by observation.
I think the caveat to that, from what I've noticed, and I think this was part of the issue with our study, is that they can learn by observation when that fear factor isn't so strong.
Yes.
that if they're right under a threshold or at that level of fight or flight, they won't learn from observation. And so exactly.
But the to counter that, in a sense, is they're actually observing and learning, but they're feeding off of that fear and they're duplicating that fear. So then it just messes up your training but we've noticed, I've done animal rescue for 44 years with the other animals especially, but we've always rescued horses through all 44 years, just at different levels. But they do so many things that are perceptive that we don't even realize they're doing. That, again, it's not, oh, hey, he flicked his ear, or that tail flicked, or and I don't know about being telepathic or anything like that, but I'm just saying, like, when we come in with a new trailer of rescued animals, all of our animals will run with the trailer as if they're saying, hey, and they can't see them. It's an enclosed trailer. We drive these trailers back and forth many times empty, and they never do it. I mean, they know there's energy, there's animals in there, and they're welcoming them more or less. And so anytime we have animals, whether it's horses or not, like we even have kangaroos and ostriches and all sorts of animals, but they do a ton of stuff mentally somehow. I don't know what's going on, and I don't purport that it's telepathy or anything else, but I just know that there's so much communication going on at some other level, that whether it's fear or whether it's, the calmness and going, hey, trust this, trust that, or whatever. But again, when we get to training animals, you always got to remember that, hey, I always look for signs like any other trainer. I'm like, okay, there was a tiny sign there, a tiny sign here. And those are indicators, and they're very helpful. But then you also got to go, why did that just fail when I didn't see any sign of that it was going to fail? And most of the time it was because something like that was going on, where the energy was, let's just call it the energy, because the wonderful thing about our sanctuary is when people come with the carnivores and they'll say, gosh, all your animals are just calm and laying around, and I'm like, yeah, and what's amazing about that is when we bring the new animals in and they're doing the fear, the fight or flight, and they're lunging at the other animals. Maybe they share a fence line and they're like, and hitting it, and the other guy's like, hey, chill it, man. You'll see in a day or two, you're gonna like it. And having no negative energy back instantly brings the other guys down like exponentially. And within 2 days, they're just hanging out just like everybody else, like they've been there a million years, And so having that energy by everybody else not getting worked up just totally deflates all that negative energy that the new guys bring in.
I love that. In behavior sciences, we like to call that emotions instead of energy. So we talk a lot about like the emotional state of the animal and how like our own emotional state can really influence their emotional state. Yeah, and what's super cool, we don't quite have the science behind this yet, and we really want to understand it, but we do know that horses can evaluate your breath rate and heart rate from 4 feet away, at least 4 feet away, and while you're on your back. We know co-regulation can occur. We know that they can be impacted by it and impact other animals. But something like you've mentioned that's sort of like that, like telepathy kind of idea is, I think it's amazing how horses can understand your intention. And when you're very clear about your intention, but I think your intention has to be tied with your emotional state. So you really need to understand what emotions you're exhibiting with your intention. And it's like they just know. They know you're not a threat, or they know you want to step over the log and they're going to step with you, or, they understand you're not trying to hurt them. And it's powerful. I agree. Yeah.
I did find it powerful that Pat's talking about how it's all animals. Like
Yeah.
you bring in all
Yes.
these animals.
Yes.
And then you start thinking, wow, I just think that there's something really significant in that statement.
Yes.
Yeah, I
full-
agree,
yeah.
and that was a great thing to put back to us. One of the other things I think with training Mustangs is they have a wonderful sense of smell. Their olfactory system is amazing, and so I don't know the science behind why I smell like I smell, and I believe you smell different at certain times of the day.
Yep.
And your fear, obviously, the fear or the quiet that you feel through your body, they definitely pick up on that. So.
Absolutely, yeah. They can detect pheromones, they can detect hormones, they can detect cortisol through their sense of smell. That's their number one way of identifying each other, even in the social structure. So I think and something we had an audience member make comment about how all animals seem to be more perceptive and more open to the intention of other animals and influenced by that intention, even more so than humans, right? And I think that's part of it, is that their senses are so highly developed, and humans probably could be, but we rely so much on sight. We rely very heavily on what we see, and then we let what we see get really mixed up with that big prefrontal cortex that likes to try and make meaning out of everything. And 99.9 times we're wrong.
Yeah, exactly. And that's just it, is, we're a species that likes to observe others and mimic what others do, and so we kind of all fall into these molds that are very blinding to so much of what you just talked about. But a really good friend of mine who was involved with the sanctuary for years got into, I don't even know what it's called, it's survivalist of some sort, where you go out and they literally go out into the desert with nothing. I mean, some of them are crazy enough to just go naked, but really, truly nothing that they can use that's outside of their being, themselves. And you can't just do it instantly. You have to learn, and there's a lot to it. But in the few years that it took him to get to where some of the things they do to prove that they're like one with nature, or whatever you want to say, they would, like slowly crawl up just like Native Americans would do and get right next to like a buffalo or whatever, and the animal not have any fear. They look at them as if they're a plant. And so his connection over those 2 or 3 years with sight and sound and smell and the things that you talk about, his perception of people's, attitude and feelings, and just went from where he was in the beginning was as close to a city-born, like totally blind to everything kind of person, to being one of the most connected people that I ever met, that was connected to the earth and what was going on. And I think that if all of us could just, even for a moment, have 10 minutes like that and go, oh my God, I've been so blind, and so it'd be like you had a blindfold on and earplugs on, and all that, and your nose was plugged, and all of a sudden you took all those off and you went, oh my God, look at this world, and so I think that that's what those animals do on a full-time basis, and we just need to make sure we understand that that's the level they're at, and we're at this other level, and we need to work as hard as we can to try and come to that level with them, or at least if we're trying to help them or accomplish something with them.
Something you said earlier that I absolutely loved is those behavioral indicators. And I call them the low-hanging fruit, because there are these really low-level indicators of maybe it's stress or avoidance or fear, and they're trying to tell us in a very subtle way, or even the horse itself might just be in its body saying this and not yet even aware. And when we respond to those low-level indicators, even if it's just with a pause, right? Just pausing and saying, I hear you. It's amazing how we can help the horse reset their nervous system in that moment. And I think it's something that, especially like in the equine industry, we've taken those low-level indicators and we've mislabeled what they actually are, right? As lazy or dominant or,
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And then it causes us to immediately become punitive because we feel like we've been disrespected, or when really what it was just a physiological response to a trigger that was fearful. And if we had just paused, let them reset, they would have checked back in. Yeah.
I love that. It kind of brings me around to thinking about if we could help adopters understand those behaviors and how to look for them, the subtle behaviors that are fear. And the other thing I think about with working to get horses into homes. Now I know, Patrick, you have a sanctuary, and to me that's the most beautiful thing we could do for these horses. But they do need to get adopted because there are so many of them. And I believe if the adopters knew a little bit more about horse behavior, and also if they understood and really thought about it in their brain that the horse is a prey animal and they're a predator. Yeah. So every way they move, every move they make can affect the horse.
Right, absolutely. And I think one of the things that we learned early on with the Mustangs, because like I said, we've been involved with horses forever, but domestic horses, ones that were born and raised in captive settings with people, and I always try to tell people it was really a big step for even me to go, oh my God, it's like the difference between a tiger in a zoo and a wild tiger. These are wild animals. They're not the same as domestic horses. They might be physiologically the same and have, the same parts, but oh my God, they've been raised from day one, being in the wild, surviving. And so when you start to realize, like people say, oh, well, you're going to, you're going to feed them hay and you're going to feed them water and you're going to do this. And I said, well, I can. But truly, these guys have learned, just like I talked about the guy that did the survival thing, these wild horses, these Mustangs, have just learned incredible skills to survive in the wild. And Northwest Colorado is a really great example, because when we bought the ranch that's right near the Sandwash Basin, it happened to be the winter that there was 40 plus inches on the ground for like 6 months, almost, 5.5, 6 months, to where, elk and deer were dying and starving, and instantly, most people would be like, oh my God, my horse out back would have been dead the first 2 weeks, because they really just depend on people and depend on food being brought to them or given a pasture that has good grass. And these horses are like, nope, we deal with this. They truly do dig down in the ground to find water. They truly do whatever it takes to survive, and that includes injuries and everything. So to me, it's like they're completely different animal to me, even though they're not, only because they're just generation after generation after generation has been so close to having to have those survival skills, or they died early on.
Yeah, I love that, because even if we get, we can get past the fear factor in the training, right? And so when we get past the fear factor in training and they trust people, something that I have always found remarkable about Mustangs is they can still be challenging in traditional domestic horse environments. So a great example, most of them can destroy a netted like a hay net. They're like, I'll just rip a big hole in it and eat through the hole, right?
Yeah, they have no constraint.
Yep.
They're like, oh,
yep.
There's no rules for I don't follow the rules that don't tear this up. Or,
Most of them are pretty easy keepers, so very easy to gain weight. Most of them like to dig through. Most of them don't like their water heated.
Yeah.
I'm saying most. I shouldn't generalize. But they'll find problems with stuff that we know, a typical domestic horse would probably not even bat an eye at, and try and solve the problem.
Yeah, and that's where I was going back to what you were saying about people that are adopting, and they are perceiving them as domestic horses. And so they're thinking, oh, I'm going to get it, I'm going to take it to the corral, and then I'm just going to spend some time being nice to it, and I'll give it carrots, and sure, those things, over time might work or might not, but they don't realize that they're starting with a truly wild animal. That'd be like saying, oh, I want you to go out in the forest, capture a tiger, take it to your backyard, and tame it in the next 4 or 5 months. And they're going to go, that's like not my chances about that much of succeeding. And you go, okay, well, that's your chance with a Mustang. If you don't do it the right way, you've got almost zero chance of having it turn out like you think it's going to be. And that perception needs to be right to begin with. I don't want to see people be afraid to adopt or to take one. And so your program of coming up with something that might be viable would be awesome, because then they say, hey, I actually have some tools that might actually make my percentage go much bigger than being, 1 in a million that I might make this work. Now I'm at 50-50 or whatever,
That's actually the point. Oh, sure.
I'm just curious. It was actually for you, Pat, my question. I'm curious to hear a little bit about what do you think are some of the big misconceptions when people get a Mustang? Like, what is it that they're doing, simple steps that they could just kind of step back and think?
That's just it, is the program that she's talking about is everything is wrong, because again, if they went into it, like some people that know horses really well would go into it going, oh, this is a wild animal, I got to start from at the very, very lowest part and come up with things that I wouldn't normally have to do for a domestic horse. I got to start with zero and go from there, where, if it was somebody else's domestic horse and it was raised, even if it had never been broke or trained, but it had been around, the mare was trained or whatever, and then people came out and fed it. You're starting up here, you're got so much more ahead of it. So I think that's the thing, is you don't want people to be afraid of it, but having the right tools would help tremendously with these adoptions.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. When we look at sort of traditional horse training, we use a lot of pressure, right? So, and we release that pressure when the horse does the right behavior, but it's a very kind of common standard way of training. When we look at a Mustang, that pressure can be way too much, sending them over threshold. And then with a Mustang, over threshold is, I will run 5 hours until I drop dead of a heart attack, or I'll scale a 6-foot panel and I'll keep running until I find my band, not another horse. You know, domestic horse gets out, they'll find another horse. But a wild horse gets out, they want to find their band. So they'll go forever and ever and ever. And so I think the short answer is, when we think of trying to gentle a Mustang and train a Mustang through the domestic lens, we use way too much pressure. We isolate them thinking it will help them, and it actually doesn't, because if they're isolated, they're even more scared. And we don't know how to release pressure. Those low-level indicators of stress, we don't know how to release or have other tools that says, how can I respond to this? This horse is clearly afraid. How can I change my approach? In domestic horses, we still have a lot of horses that this type of training doesn't work. As I mentioned earlier, 35% of horses in rescues are behavior related, but they just don't scale a 6-foot panel and get away or die of a heart attack, right? So we blame it on genetics or, the personality of the horse. Yeah.
And not the training.
Right.
So I love it when you talk about, releasing pressure, because that's another thing. I'm not the best horse trainer in the world, but I try to learn that. Earlier today, I saw you talking about putting pressure on a horse to make it walk forward. And a really good trainer knows that as soon as they take that first step, you better take those legs off, because that's the reward. And I think that for some adopters, it's very hard to learn that. And I do have a question for you. Sarah, what have you guys found out at CSU, or what was your plan when some of those horses didn't respond to the clicker training? Some of the ones that were much more frightened.
This is my favorite question, because this comes to a journey that I went on personally. So when I realized that a lot of pressure was just too aversive for Mustangs, and we had to kind of change our approach, it sent me on this clicker training journey. I was like, oh, clicker training has to be the answer. But I will tell you, the most dangerous horse I've ever met was a clicker trained horse that was clicker trained incorrectly, and it had it was resource guarding, and they were using a high value food reward. And so when that happened, I took all my tools and I was like, I don't know what the right answer is, right? Anyway, it took me on this deep dive of trying to understand, what do we do with other animals? There's what's called cooperative care training in animals that are in rescues and zoos. You've got the lions, you've got the elephants, the giraffes. They use clicker training to do cooperative care. But then we also have dogs in rescues that are really aggressive, where clicker training won't work. No amount of food can coax them out. They would rather attack you or try and bite you. So there was actually a method that was constructed. It's an old method, but it has a name now, called the constructional aggression treatment. And essentially what that is using the release of your own pressure when there's a pro-social behavior from an animal that is not an aggressive or flight behavior. So in other words, I find where your flight zone is and I don't breach it. So I find that level of arousal or threshold where I'm not going to breach that. I'm not going to get close enough where you feel like you need to run away or defend yourself. And that's where I start working. And when I have 2 eyes, I walk away. So the animal starts to learn, if I look at you, that's all it takes for you to leave. Then they get curious. And what I have found happen, we've done this, I haven't had to do it with a Mustang yet, but I have done it with rescue cases that were cases of abuse. So these horses were cases of abuse. They're the ones that start to come closer as you retreat every time they start to come closer. So the animal actually bridges the gap. What the science shows, which is so cool in dogs, is that when the animal realizes that the person is no longer a threat, then their curiosity, that investigative side of the brain, takes over, and they are curious to sort of investigate. And horses, I see it anecdotally, we don't have it in research yet, but I see the same thing happen. So it's negative reinforcement, using the release of my pressure in response to a behavior, but it's really more like clicker training, because I'm marking stuff I like. Does that make sense? Yeah.
The two
Well,
eyes. And
Yes.
then
Yep.
I'm marking those.
I'm not forcing it. Yep.
So the base of it is, if there's a horse standing over there and everybody's walking by, the first person that stops and looks at him, right away that's like, oh my God, you're looking at me, why?
Yes.
That could be good, it might be bad, I don't know, but I'm going to assume it's bad.
Yeah.
People do the same thing. You know, there's people that never look each other in the eye, that kind of thing, because that's your first indicator that, oh crap. So when we go on rescues for lions and tigers and things like that, most 90% of things are legal confiscation. So law enforcement is with us, and we go in, and there's sometimes it's insane law enforcement where they're, you know, throwing flashbang bombs and kicking doors down. But either way, when we go in, there's usually a lot of armed guys that are, you know, either concealed, or they might be holding a shotgun or whatever. But they're observers that basically they're there for protection, but they're not helping load animals. So they're observing just because they got nothing else to do. They're just supposed to be there and kind of occupy the space. And they're almost always the first ones that say, pardon me, how come all these animals are looking at you? And I'll say, because first thing they recognized was all this chaos came in, somebody was giving the orders. And whoever was giving the orders is the one that's got the most power and the most threat to me. And if they ever look at me, then I'm in trouble. And so they're watching me to see if I ever go, okay, and they're going to go, oh crap, it's my turn. And then they have to deal with that. You know, it might not be a bad experience, but either way, they just know that eye contact means, okay, it's on, now it's me. And so I think that what you're talking about with these horses, we see it all the time with these animals where they're just like, okay, who's in charge? I don't care about you, I don't care about you, I don't care about you, because that's the threat. You know, that's the threat. And so we try to explain to people all the time about, in zoo settings, you know, about the stereotypical pacing and things that go on. I would love it for everybody to be able to go to the zoo at night when there's nobody there. And of course, not everybody go at once, but just one person go in, and you'd see how calm everybody's just laying around. They could care less. You could walk up there and they're not going to get upset or anything. But when all these people come in and they're coming towards their safety zone, their home, that's the pressure that instantly is like, and in the wild, it's fight or flight. Like, if you're coming to my territory, I'm either going to beat you up and make you go away, or if you're bigger than me, I'm going to run away, and one of the two. But we're not going to just stand here and have a fight, you know, and we're going to solve it one way or the other. But in a zoo setting, they can't. So, you know, they can't go. They'll go back in the back, but most zoos close the door so that they're on display, and then that's when they're caught between a rock and a hard spot. So they start pacing because of that energy that they got to release, that negative fear and energy. So in our place, they all have, you know, large 5, 10, 20 acre habitats. And so if a public was going to come there, they would just go to the other side of the 20 acres and they could be like, yeah, whatever, they're no pressure, right? Because I could go that far away. And so we don't allow the public to be on the ground at the sanctuary out there for that specific reason. We don't want them to have to go sit at the other side of their 20 acres and waste the whole day going, when are these people going to leave so I can use the rest of my space, you know? So when they're elevated, for some reason in their mind, sky and air isn't territory. It's not a threat. You know, and I use the analogy that airplanes, like, we all know there's jets up there and there's people up there, but I don't walk around going, oh crap, you know, trying to avoid the jet or worried that the people are looking down at me or anything. But if I walk under a much shorter thing, I gotta go, oh, I hope somebody doesn't spit on me or drop something, or my fear starts to come alive at a certain point. Well, for them, early on, 40 years ago when I was starting to work, when I'd be up on a rooftop working, I was always worried about the power tools scaring them, and it didn't matter. I could be doing banging, sawing, doing whatever, could care less. And the minute you step on the ground, they're all like, uh-oh, this could be trouble, you know, they want to know. So you start to realize that they all have certain ways of perceiving danger where we would have thought, oh, well, that's dangerous. And they're like, no, that's not dangerous at all. This is dangerous. But it goes back to when you talked about walking away from a horse or whatever. You know, we always watch these movies where they say, oh, this guy is going to be out in the wilderness and there's a wild wolf comes, and he knows just to ignore him, and then the wolf will eventually come up and be his friend, you know, that kind of story. But it's true in the sense that he never once looked at the wolf like, hey, come here with that focus. The more you ignored them, the better chance you had that they were going to come up. So, all animals do it because we work with, like I said, this giant spectrum of animals, and it doesn't matter if it's a turtle. We had these turtles, these giant tortoises that were in the vet clinic for a short period of time, like a week, and they were going to go to a tortoise sanctuary, but they couldn't stand it when you weren't paying attention to them, you know. So you'd think it was the opposite. They'd be like, oh, this is great, you know, nobody's bugging me, but they couldn't stand it. They'd be like, if you weren't looking at them, like if you looked across the room, they were like, hey, like nothing. But if you looked away, they were like, and a tortoise doesn't really have a lot of ways to get your attention, like banging on the floor. So they would go over and start to crash into pans or whatever they could do that made noise that we'd look. So that whole looking is a giant part of the whole equation.
Yeah, and I think it also kind of goes back to the difference between domestic horses and Mustangs, but why we should use Mustangs as sort of the foundation of how we should work with all horses. But when we look at like that, what often happens in the traditional training environment with domestic horses is we look at a lot of this stuff as like disrespectful, and you have to make them do it. You have to make them do it once, or you're teaching them the wrong thing, so make them do it once. And something that I've really learned, actually the study that I did showed me that I never ever had to use increasing pressure. I didn't have to. I could ask differently. So if the horse wasn't responding to your cue, you just ask differently. Or if they're still stuck with the question, then you ask something else that they'll respond to. So us stopping in the moment doesn't mean that the horse is getting the best of you, or, if you change what you're doing in the moment. So of course we don't want to accidentally reinforce behavior by stopping all behavior on our part. We want to do something. But there are ways we can do training that doesn't require increasing pressure, doesn't require punitive methods. And I think that the Mustang is the great example of that, because if you use those kinds of methods, it's just not effective. And one thing that you mentioned, the fight or flight response, that I love to bring up in horses is the freeze response. So a lot of times with horses, and this is true with both domestic and Mustangs, but when we think about their reality, is something threatening or non-threatening. That's all they care about, is like, is this threatening or is this non-threatening? And horses, especially Mustangs, are highly evolved to identify things as non-threatening, because if they were spooking at everything all the time, they would waste a lot of energy. So they're actually really good at identifying, is this threatening or is this non-threatening? The problem is we demand that they identify things to be non-threatening, and we usually demand it through pressure, right? So it's not scary, it's not scary, stop moving your feet. But what we often accidentally do is send a horse into a freeze response. They can't run, they're not going to fight because they're not really aggressive by nature, so they freeze. And then we don't understand why maybe 5, 10, 15 minutes later, we're laying on the ground and they got away from us, or we got bucked off, or a even lower level indicator. If they're spooking on something on one side that you're trying to introduce them to something novel, and they stop moving, and then you bring that novel object to the other side and they spook again, it's because it's still threatening to them. It's not because it's a new brain or new eye, it's because the thing is still threatening. So when we look at exposing Mustangs in particular to new things, but again, I think this is true for all horses, it's really learning how can we help them acclimate to stuff, adjust to their environment and surroundings and new things in ways that doesn't demand it from them. Because they can identify very quickly on their own if we give them that chance. But if we send them over threshold into that flight zone, we're not even giving them the chance. Yeah.
I would say that what I believe is that Mustangs learn a lot quicker, and the retention is a lot better when they're allowed to make some choices.
Yes.
So what Sarah was talking about is, forcing them to do something that they feel is frightening. To me, it just makes that horse even more frightened. And I think as humans, we want them to do what we want them to do, right? And I believe that there's a change coming in the equine world. It's very slow in coming, but it's coming, and I've been through it with dogs because I'm a lot older than you guys. And 25 years ago or so, people had the old traditional dog training. We used
Dominance
to call
hierarchy.
it dominance hierarchy, and we used to call it jerk and puke method, when you jerked on the chain around their neck. And most people don't do that anymore with dogs. I think a lot of people have really embraced a kinder way, and I see it happening with the horses. And I hope that with our Mustang trainers and our Mustang adopters, maybe we can help that spread even more.
I didn't want to take over the audience questions, but I don't ride horses. I'm not a horse trainer. I know how they react, but I feel like I know a lot of animals, and I can look at an animal and I can tell from just years of filming and being around them, but I know the respect. But what I really think was interesting is when you're talking about they're giving you little hints of how they're feeling. And it's funny because I think we have to spread the word and show everybody out there besides just animal lovers, horse lovers, what it is about all these animals, including the Mustangs, and how they're coming in and they're showing the compassion, but they're giving everybody these little tips, these little clues, you know, and I was just curious to talk about that.
Yeah, one thing that I learned in the Mustang study where we did the clicker training is when we gave the horses the option to participate, when it came to like learning novel things that were kind of scary, I remember asking myself, like, how are we going to train these horses to do scary things if they have a choice not to participate, right? That was my first fear, is that they just wouldn't. And actually, as I mentioned earlier, that wasn't a problem. The all-stars of that group were lined up ready for their turn. But because these horses had learned very early on that if they got scared, they could walk off, just simply walk off. What happened was, if something made them nervous, here's a great example, fly spray, teaching them to take the fly spray. And so they would stay when we would spray it all around and make the noise, they could smell it, and they wouldn't try and leave, and we would click and reinforce. But every time it makes initial contact, I know they're gonna get a little nervous about it, right? And so first time it made initial contact, one of our little all-stars, he just did this little walk and this circle, and then came right back to where I was standing, and I went right back to fly spraying him, and then clicked and rewarded. And so the point of it with these like low-level indicators and allowing them to express that is that that was safe for both of us. He didn't feel like he had to spook. And I wasn't offended that he walked away, right? I understood that he needed a minute to just feel okay with what was going on. I like to say that horses don't say no because they're like rude or defiant or being stubborn or being dominant. That's not why they say no. They say, I'm not ready. And there's a huge difference, because if you can prepare your horse to be ready, then they say yes. They're so compliant and willing. That's why we can ride horses and not elk or zebras, right? So anyway, yeah, I love that, yeah.
I just love what Sarah was just talking about, because I just went through this with a horse. I have a horse that's never been touched before. He's never been haltered before, never had a human touch, and he's very sensitive to fly spray. Or flies, I'm sorry, very sensitive to flies, and with positive methods, I can't touch him. I don't even go inside his corral. I stand outside the corral and I can fly spray him. Can't touch the horse yet, but he's happy to be fly sprayed, and when he sees the fly spray bottle, he says, oh yeah, I like this, I'm coming right over. So it made me laugh when you were talking about that.
Yeah, awesome.
Well, it comes down to, I think a lot of people can relate, since there's other animals that we interact with a lot more than obviously than domestics, or definitely a lot more than Mustangs. But a lot of people that have dogs or something else, you know, you work with a dog, and of course puppies are happy, and you know, they want to do whatever, and sometimes they do things that are not good, but whatever, they're happy, and they're all. But you know, as you have a relationship with a dog or whatever, it could be a cat or something else. And if you really care, you know, you find that love you have for the animal, you want them to be happy and enjoy things. And so, you know, if you look back, let's say a long time ago, when people had to use a horse to plow a field to survive or whatever, and maybe didn't have the luxury of saying, geez, this is somebody that I care about. But you hear about, you know, cowboys who love their horses, and that was their lifelong companion or whatever. But the key is that if you're going to interact with an animal, whether it's because you have to and you need it as a tool or whatever, obviously you'd like it to function well and do its thing. But so many people get into these, whether it's horses, cows, lions, tigers, whatever, and then once they get to a point and they've gone past whatever misperceptions they have of the animal or whatever, they start to care, then they start to think about, oh, well, does he like this or not? And so some people go, oh, well, you know, my horse doesn't really like dragging a plow out in the field, you know, he'd rather not do that, you know, and then you think, well, do I really need him to do that? And so a lot of people can make choices one way or the other based on where they're at in that whole relationship with their animals, all sorts of animals, you know, they might have chickens and get eggs from them or whatever, but you eventually get to the point where you're thinking, oh, well, does he like this? And so sometimes you can say, okay, well, my goal is I need him to plow the field, but I want him to like it. And so you can use the analogy of like draft horses that some of these guys do pulling with. And initially you're thinking, oh my God, that's hard work and it's so stressful, and they're working really hard. But they start to enjoy the fact that they're succeeding at this, and you realize that they're getting some sort of gratification out of being good at something like that. And it goes back to like prisons of saying, oh well, you can't just have prisoners sitting around, we got to give them a job so that they feel like they have a sense of worth in this life, in the world, and so you find that all the animals, including our exotic animals, when they go into these habitats, just because you give them a habitat and you give them toys, and they still have to have a sense of purpose, and they still have to feel like I enjoy what I'm doing, and I really like all these things. And some of these things bring joy just because it's fun to get in the water and swim and play and splash, and it didn't take much to get them to like that. They liked it just naturally. But other things, they got to learn to like them, and then they go, oh, this is really actually fun and cool, and I like doing this, and I like jumping. And a lot of the horses I've had over the years got a kick out of challenges, like they'd be, I like the fact that I can go up this hill that's almost vertical, and you're like, this is crazy, why do you enjoy this? But that horse found joy in it, or found some purpose in it, or whatever. And so I think that that's part of the equation, whether it's a Mustang or a domestic horse, is we want them to do these certain things that we need or want, but at the same time, if there's a way to look at it from their perspective of how can I make it to where he or she or whatever enjoys this, or finds something positive in it, rather than just do it. I don't care whether you like it or not, find a way to make it better.
I love that you bring that up. So I had a student tell me once in my class, my horse loves his twisted wire snaffle bit. Uh-huh. And she was being serious, like she was serious. And I said, that's an interesting statement. Tell me more. How do you know that? How do you know he loves it? And she said, well, he is such a great mover and jumper when he has the twisted wire snaffle in. He loves his job. He works so hard. He clears all of his jumps. But when I put him in a smooth wire snaffle, he doesn't listen. He runs through the bit. He refuses jumps. And so that was clearly probably not love, right? And I think in our industry, you bring up such a really great point, because we focus so much on negative welfare, poor welfare. We focus so much on improving management standards, but we don't have a really good tool of measuring happiness in animals in general. Like, we struggle even in the science of measuring, is this animal truly happy? How is their well-being truly? I can tell you, in the Mustang study, we did a cognitive bias test. So you can measure an animal's outlook on life, their cognitive bias, like half glass full, half glass empty outlook on life. There's been really cool studies where we've seen, for example, cattle that have been dehorned without analgesics they'll score really low on the test, versus those that had analgesics and like pain medication will score really high. We've seen training practices influence cognitive bias, and we even did it in our Mustang study. We did a cognitive bias test, and we're completely blown away by the animal's like outlook on life, that sort of pessimism versus optimism outlook on life. So it kind of goes back to what you're speaking to. I think that we all sometimes have work that's hard that we may not like significantly enjoy to do, like mowing your lawn or shoveling your snow. But if you have that half glass full outlook on life, that optimistic outlook on life, and there's people around you that fill that for you, then it makes the things you do easier. And I fully believe that's true with animals. If we meet their needs and then some, if we are reinforcing to their daily life and we're providing them something that feels like half glass full, then even the things that we enjoy that they may consider work and not as fun, they're going to show up a lot better for us. So that's the next phase of research, though, is like, how can we truly measure behavioral indicators? We know behavioral indicators of stress, fear, avoidance, those are easy. But behavioral indicators of true contentment, true like pro-social peace, that's the stuff that we really want to look at.
So there's times that over the years that we've had animals that had to do something that was negative and they didn't like it, and you were like, okay, well, what are we going to do to solve this? And the irony was that most times what worked best was to not let them do it. And at the beginning, they don't want to do it. But if you were doing something and you were doing what they were supposed to do, And every time they came over, he went, no, go away. You know, instantly, it was just amazing at whatever level the animal was like, well, what do you mean I can't do it? You know, and then pretty soon they're like, no, let me do it. And you're like, no, I'm doing it. And as silly as that whole equation is, it changed their perception of that work and that whatever that thing was that I wanted them to do. And then they'll do it instantly every time because they're like, oh, well, he's doing it and he doesn't want me to do it, so I want to do it. You know, just this whole psychology that's built into all of us as living beings, whether we're humans or horses or dogs or whatever. But we've used that so many times over the years, and we're not really training animals on a full-time basis or anything like that, so it's not like we do a lot of it. But I always kind of chuckle to myself when I use that tool, because I'm always like, no matter what I do, I can't make you do this, and you just don't want to do it. So I'm going to do it. And then they're like, oh, okay, if you're doing it, I'll do it. And I'm like, no, don't do it. And the more I do that, the more they desire to do it. It's crazy.
I was a professional dog trainer for a while, and I saw that a lot in the dog industry. I used some of those techniques, like, sorry, you can't do this. No, I really don't like you. You know, ignore or whatever. And then the dogs or the puppies just want to do it more. And I don't really know about horses, and I guess there should be hopefully a lot more studies coming out, especially about the behavioral indicators. That would be very exciting to know when a horse is content and happy by his behavior.
Yeah, I think the biggest difference between dogs and horses is, and from my experience, feel free to speak in on this for sure, because this is somewhat anecdotal, but dogs are very, like, they care about social affirmation, not just in their pack, but also from people. They care about social affirmation. Horses only care about safety. So horses will put up with kind of a not so great person and not so great other horse if it makes them feel safer. It's just safety in numbers kind of a thing. They don't care as much about social affirmation. They don't care as much about, did I make you feel good in this? That doesn't mean that I don't think that there's stuff that happens in the nervous system when they make individuals feel good. I think that goes back to that co-regulation piece. But I think the importance of that means that because dogs and humans are so social affirming, that we can handle a certain amount of aversiveness, unpleasantness from other people and still want to try and overcome that. Like, give you the benefit of the doubt. It's okay you were a stinker, but I really want you to like me. Whereas horses are like, I'm scared of you, period. I'm going to hang out with you because I'm safer by you, but there's still there's a level of mistrust here that will never go away because of your aversiveness. Does that make sense? Yeah. What are your thoughts?
No, I agree in that in a lot of ways. I was going to ask if there's anybody in the audience that wants to ask a question to any of us or bring up something.
Let's do some questions.
One of the things I'd like, because we did get a little off topic, because the whole focus is about the Colorado horse, and we got about a half an hour yet. So if both of you, because you're South Carolina, can kind of talk a little bit about what you're doing for the horses off range, and then we'll take about 15 minutes for questions. So if you take about 10 minutes in that, talk about that. But it's been a great discussion, so, oh my gosh.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I'm sorry we got off on it, but it's just amazing when you work with, everybody here works with animals, dogs, horses, whatever, cows. But for us, we got involved with the horses here. Many years ago, we were focused, this is probably 20 years ago or so, with PMU horses, which are the horses that were coming out of Canada that because of Premarin and all the breeding that they were doing to get the hormone that they needed for estrogen and that kind of thing. But so we did a ton with those, but we've always rescued horses, but not on purpose. Like we go to this rescue and there'd be lions or tigers, but they might have a zebra or they might have a donkey or whatever. So we've had a lot of equine over the years. But so we have these points where we do focused and then just kind of random and focused. But being a Colorado native, I really cared when I heard, that the horses here were being affected, because we were very lucky that they weren't affected for, quite a long time. And so being in something that I consider to be a native animal, even whether it's debated or not, they were here long before I was here. So anybody that's been here longer than me, I always give respect to. But the point of it is that, we heard about it. We wanted, all of our supporters were calling and saying, hey, help these horses. And I was like, okay, but what's the solution? Again, that's the magic question. What's the solution to this whole Mustang problem? And there's so many complex parts to it. So our thing was, okay, one thing we can do is there's all these animals that do come off. There's all the ones that get adopted or whatever, but there's these rejects and there's all these ones that don't get adopted. So let's help there. And then so we decided, okay, let's go out and find as big a ranch as we can or biggest property that would be perfect for these horses. And so we found the 23,000 acres up in northwest part of Colorado. We purchased it, and it's amazing. It's, got Lake Creek going through it. It's got a ton of water, ton of grass. So our solution is more or less just saying, hey, there's only one piece of this giant puzzle, but we can help this, and let's do it. And I think everybody's doing their part, what they can do. Again, down in the Carolinas, you're doing your part. Everybody does their part. But that's what our solution was. But still, we care about looking back to the root of the problem. Like most people, you want to say, okay, I am helping over here. But if we could just get to the root of the problem and solve it, then all these people wouldn't have to do everything they're doing right now. So that's kind of what we do now. We operate a 23,000 acre sanctuary up in North Colorado. We have 7,000 acres in southern Colorado that has horses on it. And then at the same time, we're trying to educate people and let them know about the problem. And we don't have the solution to it either. We're just trying to do our part that seemed like it was a gaping hole that needed to be filled. So there's a lot of people working on it, but you can talk about your program and what you guys are doing.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to say that it's hard to get to the actual root of the problem because it's pretty contentious. And so we each, I think, play the small parts that we can. And so at CSU, in our equine sciences program, what we're really passionate about is those percentage of horses that fail the gentling process. Let's make sure that that failure isn't a training method or a management method or a combination of both, because we see it so often even in our domestic horses. And so we really want to say it's not a method, right? It's not a method that we want to manualize or capture and say, do this method every time. It really falls back to using behavioral indicators to inform the way we practice with animals in general, and having enough tools in your tool belt that you know how to respond to every different behavioral indicator, whether it's fear or avoidance or pro-social. You know what to do in that moment with that specific Mustang. And so that we can increase successful adoptions and increase the success of these horses going into a riding horse, because that's another issue too, is the struggle of these horses that are out there for a long time, 5, 6, 7, 10 years. Turning them into a really solid riding horse can be a big challenge. And so we're trying to go against a lot of innately ingrained and learned behaviors at that point. But we do believe in the science of learning. We believe it's done great things for people, and we're all mammals. We learn the same way. And so really bringing that science to horses is what we'd like to do. That's the small part we'd like to play.
Yeah, that's great. And people that are here, we would hope that everybody is concerned about Mustangs, whether they're Colorado or not. Our Southern Sanctuary takes in out-of-state horses. We have Mustangs from Arizona and Oklahoma and other places. The Northwest Sanctuary is dedicated to Colorado horses only. So the 4 HMAs and some of the people that weren't here earlier, we talked about there's official horse management areas that have horses, but there's also horses that are out of bounds and in other areas that are where herds of horses, wild horses are, but they're not officially managed by the BLM. And so there's, like you say, it's a very complex subject and what can be done. But I think everybody doing their part helps to make sure the animals aren't the ones who end up paying the price and suffering. But again, if you could just go back to somehow finding the right solution to the original root problem, then you wouldn't have to have so much energy and work going into it. It's just like homelessness or anything else for people. If you can get to the root of it, then you don't have to put so much money and time into all the just daily maintenance of people like that.
I'm going to ask, does anybody in the crowd have any questions that they'd like to ask? And I'll bring the microphone, because Julianne's live streaming, so it goes through the sound system. So any questions? George? Hang on, hang on. I'm coming.
So I just want to say hi, Pat. So my name is George Brauneyes, and I'm a member of the Colorado Wild Horse Working Group.
Okay.
And also have a ragtag fugitive fleet of 30 Mustangs that are all rescues. And closer?
Yeah.
You want me louder? Oh my gosh. So anyhow, I've I've got some local Mustangs that, two off the Little Book Cliffs and one off of Piance. The two off the Little Book Cliffs are a bonded pair, and they're in their early teens and are choosing kind of like, they tolerate humanity, but they would like to be stretching their feet more. And then my little guy off the Piance East Douglas is a 51st date horse.
Yeah.
Every day we start at ground one and he's not going anywhere. And so would love to place him with you and just collaborate more with you. Some of the smaller rescues and sanctuaries that are out there that having your sanctuary there kind of gives us a little relief that if there's a place that they can go, then that frees up a little more wiggle room for us to help the trainable and the ones that can be rehabbed get rehomed.
Right.
So.
No, exactly, and that's part of what we recognized early on was we were talking about the wild horses being rounded up, but then instantly it was like, wait a minute, that's only a part of the population that needs help. All the people that are initially taking those horses and trying to get them to be where they're useful and people can have them, and then there are those ones that are just flat refusing to be trained, and they're obviously a huge expense and time and burden for everybody who's doing. Let's say you succeed in getting 7 out of 10 to be great, and those 3 out of 10 are add up, and pretty soon you got 30 or 40 horses that are not going to be able to be adopted. Whether that's a huge burden on you or any other organization, so that's kind of what we do is we just say absolutely, bring them up there. It's a wide open door. You just got to obviously have the paperwork and everything else that has to be done, but otherwise we accept everybody who has any Colorado-born horses. They're guaranteed to come in there. And then any out-of-state ones, of course, there's millions, of course, and we just can't help every horse, but we do have some room at the south one that every time a space opens up, we help out-of-state horses too, but absolutely, we know that's part of the problem and that it's a big burden for organizations, and we're more than happy to help.
Well, and George is also one of our Mustangers, so he's part of our education program, and watching him today almost brought me to tears. So does anybody else have any other questions?
So how many horses can you hold at both facilities?
Well, that was the magic question right from the day one.
Because it's massively huge, and I've been following you for a long time and a contributor, so was just love what you're doing, and I was curious how you can intervene with the BLM doing the horrific helicopter roundups that maim and kill horses. Can they just gently get them over to you if they don't want them to where they're at?
No, absolutely. And as we all know, especially people that are obviously involved with the industry, it's easy to not, you don't want to say no, and then you end up getting overwhelmed, and then your land becomes trashed and it's overgrazed. And so again, our concern is, we would love to help thousands and thousands, 20,000 horses, but obviously the land couldn't do that. So early on, since we do have some BLM property within our ranch, the BLM was like, hey, since those aren't fenced off and you can't guarantee how many horses are going to be on those pieces, we have a say in this, and we would like to be able to agree on a magic number that could go there. So obviously our option is out of the 23,000 acres, there's about 19,000 is privately owned by us, and then the rest there's like 3,000 something that's BLM. So we had to work with them, and that was a very slow process for anybody that's obviously worked with the BLM before. It's like, okay, let's go. Come on, we're kind of one of those organizations that want to just get the job done and get it done now. So it was very difficult to get them to kind of say, okay, and they wanted us to have range specialists come out and do it because they would be independent. So we ended up with 3 different range specialists evaluating the property so that everybody could have multiple numbers, like this one might say, 300, and this one says 280, and this one says whatever. So it ended up being, the initial agreement was 240 horses. That's very, very conservative, but yet 500 is too much, you know what I mean? And so the property is amazing. If you go from there, it's only 30 miles from the Sandwash Basin, and if you go from there to the Sandwash, it's like going from Kentucky to the desert. I mean, it's just amazing that 30 miles can make that big a difference, but obviously whatever breaks in the hills and the topography. So that ranch, as you can see, is amazing how much grass is on this land. The rancher before had stopped really ranching about 10 years earlier. He was leasing out little summertime for a few months or whatever, and not very many cattle. So it's had many years to recover really well. That was one of the reasons we bought it. I had a ton of water, which is another. It has 3 pivot sprinklers so we can grow a ton of hay. Plus it has a lot of sub-irrigated fields because of the Lake Creek and some other areas. So we have, we put up, I don't know, it was 2,000 or 3,000 bales of hay this summer. And the horses are just grazing wild, so we didn't feed them at all this winter, and we haven't had to. They've been doing wonderful by themselves. So we want to keep it to where it's manageable like that, where we're not going to end up with just this giant paddock that we have to feed hay year round. So everybody has their own equation of what they do, but right now we have a mutual agreement for 240. I think that could end up going up to maybe around 300 or so. But we're also looking at buying a lot more land that's adjacent to this. We just bought another 600 acres the other day, and so we're just keep on adding more and more land to it. And so we hope that number can just keep going up slowly and conservatively. We want to be responsible.
Anybody else? Are we good? Thank you so much. I learned a lot.
Well, thank you.
And tomorrow
Thank you very
afternoon, these 3 will be back again tomorrow and Sunday. So
Awesome.
great panel. Thank you, guys.